This conversation, I know oftentimes when we enter into it, this is really what you're thinking, right? If you're like many thousands of college students or even administrators, I was just having a conversation with JR, your chief financial officer in the back, and we were talking about how this conversation has needed to shift over the years because for far too long, we created a space where this is how we felt as much as how students felt. And the truth of the matter is, I bring a very different perspective into this conversation, and it was with great intentionality that your national staff sought me out to be the one that gave this message today. Not because I'm the most dynamic speaker, not because I have the flashiest PowerPoint, not because I can recite the history of PIKE or all your rules and policies better than anybody else, but I think truthfully it's because this is what I believe. And I believed this long before I found my way into the fraternity of Delta Gamma. I believed this when I first stepped foot on a college campus as a non-traditional student with 2 young boys at home that I was trying to raise, and I sought membership in the fraternal community and was told there was no place for me. And I wasn't told that with disparaging attitude, and I wasn't told that with judgment. It was authentic. At the time, unwed mothers weren't really welcome in the sorority movement. So I had to wait. But I watched the fraternity movement on my campus. I went to Southwest Missouri State. They've renamed my school. That's how old I am. They renamed my college Missouri State a few years ago. They actually asked if I wanted to have my diplomas reprinted for the low price of $300. I let them know that my diplomas were still rolled up in the tubes and I had better artwork in my office, but that was okay. But I watched fraternities and sororities. And I watched, in particular, as young men who led the Student Government Association and young men and women who were most invested in the service initiatives on our campus, the young men and women who ran the Residence Hall Association, who served on the Board of Regents, who were the ones advising our vice president and our president on the culture and the environment of our campus. I watched as those young men and women that walked into those meetings were young men and women wearing fraternity and sorority letters. And so I started my belief in you a long time ago. And it was affirmed through my membership in my sorority and affirmed through one of my son's membership in his fraternity. And this is what I believe. You are values-based organizations. You are a values-based organization. You are about creating men of character. You are about developing leaders. You are as much about committing yourselves to scholarship and academics as you are to creating lifelong servants to their community. All this language is somewhere found in the history of your fraternity, but in general, this is what fraternity is. You are as much about developing the lifelong friendships that come from this brotherhood as you are about a lifelong commitment to this fraternity. And at the end of the day, gentlemen, this is a little bit about the party. And I believe that. And all of that is value. And that's what I think is very important for us to just put in the room before we even start talking about the management of risk. And this is what you bring. This is what you bring into this room. You bring these principled statements, not just statements, but values in action. These are very easy things for me to see in this room. So why are we having a risk management speaker? If we're that great, if we're all about values, and we're all about scholarship, and we're all about service, and we're all about character, why are we having a risk management speaker? Probably because of this guy. I'm sure this guy's got something to do with it. This has probably got an awful lot to do with it. I'm confident that these folks are influencing the reason that we're having this conversation. And you know, honestly, the reason that we're really having the talk is not because of Justin Buck. It's not because of the risk management staff that works at the headquarters. It's not because of the law, and it's not because of the attorneys. They're all in the mix of this conversation. But the reason that we are having a conversation, that I want to issue a challenge to you today, is because you are a values-based organization and you are a fraternity. Pi Kappa Alpha is a fraternity that aspires to excellence. And we have to have this conversation because you're a risk-vulnerable community. I didn't believe that for a long time. This is a promise I make to every fraternity and sorority man and woman I work with. I don't operate from anecdote. You know what that means? That's the stories. We spent years having these conversations in the front of these rooms based on anecdote. And what that looks like to me is when we just assume things. We make an assumption that the reason that you don't comply with the alcohol policy is because you just don't care. We make assumptions that the reason that you engage in hazing activity is because you don't have the capacity to treat each other with respect. We have assumptions. And the truth of the matter is that in the last 10 years, there's a small contingency, and your fraternity has been in that conversation, in particular in the last 3 years, of people who have said, let's stop the anecdote. You know, we don't have to continue to show videos of young men who have died as a result of seeking membership in a fraternity. We need to stop momentarily and honor those men. We need to take a moment and remember students like Robert Champion from the Florida A&M University Marching Band that brought the issue of hazing to the forefront nationally in this country unlike it's ever been brought. We need to honor their legacy. We need to mourn their loss. But we have to stop using them as the way that we educate you about risk management. Because you know what we know is true? That fear-based risk management doesn't speak to you. How many of you have sat in that room and seen the video? It's not difficult to have a video of a Pi Kappa Alpha incident involving the death of a student, gentlemen. It's not hard for me to find a number of headlines to broadcast on these screens that have negative imagery of your fraternity. It's not difficult. I don't think it's any more difficult than it is the majority of our fraternities and sororities on college campuses today. But it certainly isn't difficult with PIKE. And what would that do for us? Well, one, I don't want you to forget that that imagery is out there. I don't want you to stop paying attention to those headlines. Some of you are sitting in this room today from chapters that have had to live through some of those critical incidents. But what I want you to think about is I want you to come into this conversation not out of fear, but out of understanding that you strive to be excellent. And you are at risk of not attaining that goal. For a long time, I used to talk to students when I was a director of student life. I started out as a conduct officer. Can you imagine having a mother who was first a conduct officer and then the risk manager for the college that you went to school at? I think both of my boys told people that I worked in landscape maintenance. I think one of them might have said I worked in the health center at one time because it wasn't like the most intriguing thing. But I spent a lot of time talking to students about why they violated policy and why they thought there was a problem in their organization. And oftentimes when we talked about alcohol in particular, students would say to me, everybody drinks. And particularly when I would have a conversation with a fraternity or sorority, they would say, you know, everybody drinks, we're just easy to identify because we have letters and everybody knows who we are. Or they would say things like, we're not the only ones that haze. You know what, that's true. And you know, a lot of people do drink. But when I finally got to the place where I wasn't burdened behind the desk of an administrator and I could enter into really trying to understand you and what you're trying to deal with, from a purely advocate perspective, I asked the researchers, I said, show me the numbers. We have to stop looking at fraternity men when they say everybody drinks and say, well, we're not everybody, we're the men of PIKE. We have to stop retorting to students when they say things to us like they were willing participants with, but the rule says that doesn't matter. Not just because you deserve more, but because it's ineffective. If all we needed was the rules and policies, things would be great. I think about that when I drive. Every day I live in the great state of Texas. One of the best things about moving back to Texas from Arizona is the 85-mile-an-hour speed limit. During the day, you never want to drive in West Texas at night because then it drops to 75. And you know what we know in Texas is true? You can go about 10 miles over the speed limit before the average highway patrolman will pull you over. So if it's 85, you can drive 95. If it's 75, you can do 85. And the fact of the matter is, when a police official pulls me over and says, I just clocked you at 83 miles an hour and a 75 on the 105 heading up to College Station, I don't say, everybody drives 85 miles an hour. I smile, I'm polite, I hand him my license, I hand him my registration, my proof of insurance. I try to go back to my youthful days or figure out how I could appeal to him as maybe reminding him of his mother, so maybe he will write me the ticket, and then I go on my way. But the fact is, in my mind, I'm thinking, damn it, everybody drives 85. He must be having a bad week. He must just be needing to get his quota in. Translate that to your world. They must be having a bad week. They don't like us. They hate fraternities. It's all about because we're Pikes. They don't like us because we're successful. They don't like this about us. You know what? I bet he never got a bid when he was in college. Right? Haven't you had that conversation? I've actually met that guy, and some of them are a little bitter. The truth of the matter is, we asked the researchers. I said, show me the money. I worked for the Department of Ed's Higher Ed Center for a while, and I took advantage of that. I didn't ask Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors or Fraternity and Sorority Life Professionals writing their dissertation to research you. I asked people that had a total investment only in the reduction of high-risk behavior. I said, tell me the truth. And this is what they said. There's a much higher probability that a young man who belongs to a social fraternity will engage in high-risk alcohol consumption than a young man who simply comes to college and lives in a residence hall. Young men who come to college and don't join social fraternities drink. About a 52% probability that they'll engage in high-risk alcohol consumption. That bumps up to about 70% when they join a social fraternity. Does that mean 70% of the men in this room engage in high-risk alcohol behavior? Well, we'll find that out at the baseball game tonight. No, the truth is, that just means you're at a greater risk. That's another thing we do. We don't just teach off anecdotes. So I want to tell you the truth. What that means is that when you step into your leadership positions, or you aspire to a leadership position, or in fact, when you accept membership in this fraternity, you're entering into an obligation to help support and protect a very high-risk population. You know who out-hazes you? NCAA athletes, by a very small percentage. About 74% probability that if you're in a social fraternity or sorority on a college campus in this country, large public, small private, that you will be exposed to hazing. That, again, does not mean 74% of the men in this room or 74% of the fraternity and sorority men and women in this country. It means there's a high probability you are a risk vulnerable community. And you need to understand that, because how can you stop it or confront it or lead through it if you don't know the truth? Sexual assault is a whole nother conversation. Federal legislation really recently passed. It's the Title IX Dear Colleague letter. Wouldn't expect any undergraduate in this room to even have heard of that. I would expect that the alumni in the room and the staff in the room have definitely probably engaged in conversations about it. Interesting little piece of legislation, always exciting to me when the federal government decides to mandate student behavior and legislate student behavior on college campuses. They're actually in discussion about some hazing legislation. Thank God the committee has gotten hung up on defining hazing. Can you imagine how difficult that is? How confusing is your own fraternity's definition of hazing? How confusing is your campus policy on hazing? Could you imagine federal legislators writing a definition of hazing? And when they got involved in this conversation about the risk issue of sexual violence, it started in response to athletes and incidents on college campuses involving athletes and rape. But boy, I tell you what, when you dig into the minutes of those meetings, and I geek out on that stuff, so I read the minutes to those congressional meetings, I study the law and where it came from because it impacts the students I work with, the word fraternity was used much more frequently than the word athlete. And the reason is because there's a higher probability that a young woman will encounter an incident of rape at a social fraternity event than there ever has been in the history of this movement. That is the one outlier in the three big areas of risk management that we talk with you about. Alcohol has been a pervasive problem in the movement for a long time. Hazing has been part of the culture. In fact, it was an accepted part of the culture of many organizations, not all, but for a period of time. But man, there was a time where the safest place for a woman to be was at a fraternity house. There was a time when the safest man for her to call or the safest people for her to party with was a fraternity man. And that's as much proven in the research from 1950 and 1960 as is the new data that says high probability. That's why we're having this conversation, because you're risk vulnerable. Legalese is important for the presidents, the risk managers, the officers of the chapter. You need to know the law. You need to know the policy of this fraternity. It's very easily spelled out. I will applaud PIKE for one thing, a lot of things, but one is you don't get all caught up in verbose language. It's very clear. Here's what we expect. And then you translate it into the principles and the values of your fraternity. It's not difficult. You need to know that. But you don't have to think about risk management as an attorney when you are engaging with risk management as a fraternity man. So instead of thinking about these men in the context of shame and what would they think, risk management needs to be thinking about it differently and thinking about these men and the foundation they laid down that defined this fraternity. One of the challenges I have when we get into conversations with fraternity men at leadership experiences is sometimes I've been to several of them in the last couple of years where they talk about the legacy. Have you ever had one of those conversations here? What's your legacy in the fraternity? What's your legacy going to be, Jonathan? How are you going to prepare for your legacy? Let's write down what your legacy is going to be. That's awesome for you. But at the end of the day, it's not about you. It is about this. It is about these men. Risk management is not about the individual. Risk management is about this fraternity. It's not about the chapter. It's about the fraternity. That's how we need to think about the founders and your history. Is what's the foundation they laid that said, this is who we will be. And you know what I love? You don't try to blow your history up to make it more than it's not. Have you ever noticed that with other fraternities? And I value a lot of fraternities. Some of them have very different histories. I've worked with fraternities that, Sigma Nu, your brothers in Sigma Nu, their fraternity literally formed because 3 guys came back from the Civil War, wanted to be in a social fraternity at VMI, and the only way in was to be hazed. And they were like, dude, I just went through the Civil War. You're not hazing me. Peace out. Think we'll create our own fraternity. ATO, formed in the Southeast at VMI, they have a really interesting history. They were the first fraternity that welcomed men from the North and the South into their brotherhood right after the war. And they had the initial opportunity to rebirth a Northern fraternity. And the gentleman who started that fraternity, initiated those conversations, said, why would we bring a fraternity purely defined by its region at a time when our country is so divided? Great stories. And I've been asking, tell me what the impetus was for that meeting in that room at the University of Virginia in 1868. And you know what I loved? I love that the answer I've been getting pretty consistently is, it was kind of not a lot of fun. They were really looking for a little social time. They were really looking for the opportunity to make friendship connections and social connections that would allow them to experience life as young men in college. And along the way, they said, we're going to do that with a little dignity. We're going to do that with a little respect. We're going to do that with a high level of character. But at the end of the day, we just want to create a brotherhood. We just want to bring guys together. That's as valuable of a starting story as anybody else's. And that's what this has to be about. The history of this fraternity needs to be as important as the rules and the policies. But the answer to a college man, your answer to the management of risk, is not found in the law. This might get a little Pollyanna. But if not in this room, that I have no idea what room it could be in, to challenge you with the language of who you say you are. The way that you need to start thinking about risk management is as a true PIKE. Power statement. One of the things that I love about it, no other fraternity, no other men's fraternity does this. And I don't know of a sorority that does it, a woman's fraternity or a sorority. No one else asks their members to make an authentic commitment to themselves, then the brother, then the fraternity, and then their community. You get it. The concept of a true PIKE is that you will be men who will live to what your ritual says you will do. That you will be men who live to the principles and values of this fraternity. So when you open up that notebook, when you get back to campus, or that moment in your chapter comes where you're expected to sign the statement of standards, or you sign the philosophy of standards, stop. Because it's not about reading them the rules. It's about stepping back and having a conversation about, what does this look like? What does it really, truthfully look like to be a true PIKE? Because that's where you find the energy to mitigate risk management. You got to rethink differently about risk management. A lot of text on the slide, but the key thing for you here is reframe how you approach it. You have to think differently about it in the context of, it's not the rules, it's not the policies, it's not the insurance, it's not the forms. Those are all tools and mechanisms to set boundaries. Think about it as like you have a play space, right? You have a box, and we create this box for you, and we say, here's the boundaries. Here's the law, here's the rules, here's our expectations. Values have a place there. In the midst of that, go be fraternity men. Go manage your risk. Go have a good time. Go be brothers. Go do that social stuff, and that academic stuff, and that service stuff, and that character stuff. Go do all of it. And when you think about risk management as a very static thing, as a form that you fill out or a set of standard rules and policies that you have to comply with, you know what happens? You do what anybody would do. And you all of a sudden, the risk assessment becomes this. What's the probability that I'll get caught? How much time do you think your chapters spend trying to keep underage people from drinking at your social events? How much time do you spend trying not to get caught? Sometimes I ask that question, I'll get a percentage. 72% of our time is spent trying not to get caught. You know what this is about? This is about thinking about things a little bit differently and shifting that to the middle. You get caught, there's consequences. But I truthfully believe if you start thinking about this as a thinking process, and you start thinking about it in the context of figuring out what it is you want to do. Maybe it's throw a raging party with an amazing theme that's politically correct and not offensive to anybody. Hard to find these days, right? Maybe it's about putting on a philanthropy event that is in alignment with all the Panhellenic rules and policies, all the IFC's policies, all the institution's expectations, and what the fraternity expects of you. A little bit difficult. Whatever it is, think about what it is you want to do, and then step back from it and talk with each other as men and say, so what could go wrong with this? Not, what could we get busted for? What could go wrong? I'm a huge fan of the mechanical bull. Anybody been on a mechanical bull recently? I'm excited. They're coming back. It's one of the things from the 80s that I'm authentically excited about. Because mechanical bulls are a pretty amazing addition to many social events. Rick is probably sitting over there going, no, I think we have a rule against mechanical bulls. I worked with a college once that told me that. Ms. Novak, we noticed that you told the University Programming Board that they could have a mechanical bull at the new student organization welcome, and I think we have a rule against that. I'm like, show me that rule. Where's thou shalt not have mechanical bulls? Is it right below thou shalt not have fun in college? Where is that rule? And you know what it was? There wasn't a rule. There was a fear. There was a concern. Big fan of the mechanical bull. You ever want to have a mechanical bull at a chapter event and we can get it past your insurance provider? I will show you how to risk manage that event because you can do it in compliance. There are risks associated with that activity. Some of them are just public humiliation. But you have to step back from it and you have to say, I accept risk is part of our fraternity. Risk is part of what you do. But what risk is not acceptable risk? When does it get to a place where we're not willing to run that risk? And that might be different for you as individuals. So you got to step into it, not just what will you as a man accept for risk, but what can your chapter accept? What kind of exposure can your chapter accept? You know where that really comes in for me? That comes into that guy. You know that guy? Socially popular, athletically talented, never pays his dues, rarely shows up to chapter meeting, problem at every social, probably in front of the standards board. But man, he's your brother. And what are we going to do? He's your risk exposure. How much risk exposure do we have to take for the chapter? What are we willing to accept? And you know what? Here's the truth. The harsh reality is that you can't stop there. Because then you have to periodically say, I would say always, but I'm not a perfectionist. Is this a risk my fraternity can accept? That's the real story behind all those headlines. That's the story behind the broadcasts that are picked up nationally about your fraternity. I was talking with one of the staff last night this morning about trying to understand what is it about certain fraternities that it seems that every incident that they're engaged in blows the headlines up, even when it's not that dramatic of an incident. Always problematic, potentially illegal, something bad's happened. And I said, why is that? Why is it not hard for me to find PIKE in the headlines? I don't think it's because you're less behaved than other fraternities. I'm trying to figure that out. Is it the result? Could it be, like your friends in SAE, could it be the result of men who made choices about themselves and their chapter that put this fraternity at too great a risk? And now we're still living down the reputation of that? You got to stop and think. And if you're not sure if the fraternity can accept the risk, then don't align the risk with the fraternity. You want a zip cord in Puerto Rico? Fraternity says we're not covering that? Then don't do it as a fraternity event. You want to drink hard and play beer pong with shots on the side, and the fraternity says can't take the risk, and you want to do it because it's what you enjoy and you find value in it, then don't put it in the chapter house. Don't put PIKE's name on it. Go do what you want to do as an individual. Understand that you're not living up to your commitment to yourself that you make as a true PIKE, But at least you're separating the risk from the fraternity, and then you have to think about your institution. Man, there was a time when they were pretty lucky, because for a long time, colleges and universities were protected. They did the Heisman with us. It was like, oh, yep, they're over there, they're a problem. The courts used to say, oh my gosh, college students are so out of control, it's not reasonable to expect universities to be responsible for their behavior. So we didn't even have to think about their risk exposure very often. Boy, that's changed. That's changed. And that's not just new fraternity and sorority life advisors trying to be hard asses on you and trying to be fun killers. That's about the courts telling universities, hey, get in the game here. You got a little responsibility to these students. You got a little investment in this relationship, and you have a responsibility to be as involved in the mitigation of risk at some instances as their national organization has. That's why they're coming deeper into the conversation. So you got to think about them as well. And once you get all that figured out, then you just move ahead. And maybe you just don't have the event. It's a really great event. Would have been an awesome event. Probably can't do that event. What else could we do? Maybe you get a bus instead of driving cars. Maybe you make a decision that you're not going to let unaffiliated freshman women come to your parties anymore. Community in this community, a major fraternity and sorority community, they're top-tier fraternities. You know what I mean when I say top-tier? It's that unofficial ranking system that you all know exists on a college campus. When the top-tier fraternities walked into their Panhellenic community and said, no more unaffiliated freshman women, it's the one thing we think we can control to mitigate the risk, because we're not going to stop partying in our houses. We're not going to stop having cheap vodka punch served at our parties. We're not going to stop overpopulating the property, all of which would cause consequence, by the way. But we need to mitigate some of the risk. And one of the risks that we have the ability to mitigate is the risk exposure of unaffiliated freshman women, probably one of the most high-risk populations on any college campus. Not anecdote. Second to that is probably the unaffiliated freshman man. Make a decision. What can you manage? And then have a plan. Do you ever fill out a form for risk management? Do you ever have to do that for campus? You fill out the form. Are you going to have security? Yes. Do you have, I love this, this is my favorite question. Are you using chapter funds to pay for the alcohol? Yes. Okay, you deserve to get in trouble. No. What does that even mean? Like, we ask some of the most ridiculous questions. You know, it's going a little farther with that. Instead of saying, are you going to have security, paperwork, process? Yes. But it's going to be the pledges? That's one of my greatest risk management concerns. Let's put the most inexperienced and underconfident guy in the chapter at the door. And you know what? Then let's find his little dorky friend and put him behind the bar. And you know what? Then what we'll do is we'll have 2 or 3 of them floating around the party, making sure everything's going okay, and hope we can hold enough of them back to drive us all to Taco Bell when we're done, or somewhere else, right? You need a risk management plan? There's my tip of the day. Don't put the pledge at the door. Because you know what that looks like, right? And then you say this. I love this. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but we say this to them. We say, risk mitigation. If they're too drunk, don't let them in. What is too drunk? Is too drunk when you're on the luggage rack? Or is too drunk when they were just carrying you into the lobby? Which is too drunk? So he's at the door and he's thinking too drunk, and she walks up. You know her, right? I know women contribute to the risk management issues, but they're not the creators of the whole problem. Had a community at the University of Arizona, the entire interfraternal community a few years back. I said, gentlemen, tell me what the biggest risk issue is. They said, women's inability to consume hard liquor. I was like, oh yeah, let's bring that on. Let's figure that one out. We got this. She comes up to the door. She's a little tipsy. She's a lot tipsy. She reeks. She's a little stumbly. The young man says, what's your name? She says, Lady Gaga. He doesn't find her on the list. He's trying to follow the rules. He tells her she can't come in. And here he comes, that guy. Dude, what are you doing? Or she says, do you know who I am? And of course he doesn't know, because he's a pledge. Right? He doesn't know who she is. And somebody says, we got to let her in. Because either she's my conquest for the night, and I need her that socially lubricated for that to happen, or I know who she is. Risk manage that. It's as simple as stepping back from that and saying, and you know what guys will say to me? Well, Kim, it's really good for the pledges to understand what it means to manage the risk. Really? Come on. Then let's put an active with them. Let's have somebody who has a little something on the side at the door with that kid to say, yeah, it's okay, but you're not coming in. Let's put somebody behind the bar so that when somebody really doesn't need to drink more, there's actually somebody who has the ability and the authority and the capacity to say no. That's risk management, gentlemen. You may still be pouring vodka, and boy, if you are and something happens, you're going to get busted. But maybe you're just thinking a little better about it. Not advocating the pouring of vodka at the party. First of all, it's a nasty liquor, and you always buy the really bad stuff. But it really is. It's a violation, and I don't want to advocate for that. But you also have to step, and once you step through that and you actually have a plan and you communicate the plan, you got to get the chapter involved in this. This is not an officer's obligation. Yes, the president's in this room. Your name will be the name on the lawsuit if and when it comes. The new member educator in the room, if you're the one running the pledge rally, your name will be on the lawsuit. You don't even have to be in the room, and if it involves new members, your name will be on the lawsuit. Not going to lie. I don't know that that case will ever make it through the courts, but the truth of the matter is the management of risk is not about the responding to a lawsuit. The management of risk is about taking care of the chapter. And I asked attorneys, I have a little pool of attorneys. They don't know that each other exists. If I keep talking about them, they're going to figure it out. One of them is ultra-conservative. Like I think about him driving 1 mile below the speed limit everywhere he is. He's that guy. Got to have him around because I like the ultra-conservative opinion. One's a little more liberal and very invested in student affairs. Never been a defense attorney or a plaintiff attorney in a lawsuit. Actually works for a college campus, but gets college students. And then in the middle of all that, I got a guy who makes his living suing fraternities, and I got a couple guys who make their money protecting fraternities. And I asked them, tell me what you're looking for if you're going to create a defense or you're not going to take action in a lawsuit. There's a great article called The Anatomy of How to Sue a Fraternity, and it talks you through what they think about before they sue. It'd be a great, if you're really concerned about that, it's a great article to read, and we'll get it to you. We can get that to you through the national office. But they said to me, Kim, this is what we're looking for. Consistently, this is what they're looking for. You need to accept responsibility, and the members of your chapter need to accept it, that they need to get involved in this conversation. You need to have systems in place that your campus has or that your national fraternity has that you will adhere to the best of your ability. You need to make sure the men in your chapter and your guests understand what you expect of them, and when things don't go right, you need to hold people accountable. And the majority of the time when these things are happening, there's less likelihood that the legal accountability will be as harsh, if existent, for a man in the fraternity. And how do you get the chapter involved? You got to change the message. Just like I can't stand in front of a contingency of men at an academy and give you the litany of thou shalt nots and get you to even think about this, you have to change the message to the chapter. There's amazing research on high-risk behavior and culture change out there. There's a very intellectual man called Dr. Klitzner. Not a very exciting guy, but he's smart. And he does all this research on how do you change high-risk environments. How do you change cultures? How do you shift communities? And you, in your own chapter, are a community. And this is one of the key principles that he found. You got to quit talking about what you can't do, and you need to start talking about what you can do. How refreshing would that be for you as fraternity leaders? Let's spend less time talking about what you can't do, and let's talk more about what it's supposed to look like. Let's make it more difficult to engage in undesirable behavior and recognize when people are doing the right thing. You have to shift the message. And the message can't come from the podium, from the risk management lady, or the insurance attorney, or the national staff. Because here's the truth. The strongest attitudinal predictor of a young man or young woman in college's willingness to participate in high risk, often illegal and dangerous behavior is the fundamental belief that it's approved of by their peers. The key message for you here is, what image is out there? Not image in the internet world, not image in the newspaper. What are you showing the men in your chapter? When a new man walks into your fraternity and you provide him the list of rules and policies that he's expected to adhere to as a member of Pi Kappa Alpha or an aspiring member, and he goes to his first social event, how many of those policies does he see violated? What message does that send? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I got it. You tell me the rules because you got to tell me the rules. But technically, I don't really have to follow the rules. And then some extreme behavior happens. And you're like, what made you think that was okay? I had a kid show up to the first social event as an associate member for a chapter I advised, beautiful golf course in Phoenix, Arizona, big event. Don't know how in the hell they ever got a country club to let them use a golf course for a fraternity party, but God bless them, they got it done. And they were all excited. This kid shows up. They had the whole risk management conversation, responsible, legal, make good decisions, don't pregame. Kid shows up. He's so intoxicated. He's excited to meet the president. Walks over, projectile vomits on his girlfriend. Can you imagine? Phone call. Oh, we had a problem, Kim. First question I had, is he still alive? Sat down with the kid. They said, what made you think that was okay? Well, I thought that's just what you really did in a fraternity. I thought that this was just like, I thought you just told me the rules because somebody told you you had to. So then they stepped back into their approach to that, and they said, well, wait a minute, let's think differently about it. In the same room, at the same party, there was another kid who didn't throw up on anybody, but they found him blacked out in a high risk level, wasn't going to die, but was in a critical state with alcohol consumption. And they said to him, what made you think this was okay? And he said, well, I was matching shot to shot in a pregame with some of the actives, and I didn't want him to think I wasn't a man. He used a different language. So how did he make his decision? Based on what the men told him or what he experienced? What message are you sending? How are you illustrating what you expect of these men when it comes to the management of risk? I'm not telling you that I expect this room or this fraternity to become a group of men who no one under the legal age of 21 ever consumes a drop of alcohol at a tailgate, that you never have a party where maybe somebody that's 19 years old doesn't do a shot. I'm not asking you for that. That's nirvana. We get there, I'm out of a job. I'm asking you to say, here's what it looks like to be a PIKE. And it's not a hot mess. It's not a mugshot. It's not passed out puking on the floor. It's not putting somebody in a humiliating or degrading environment and putting their life at risk. This is what it looks like. You have the capacity with risk management, gentlemen, to do 3 things, and we ask a lot of you. Where are the presidents in the room? The young men serving their chapters as presidents. I bet, Carson, that you've probably been to, you will, by the time your term is up, probably go to 4 or 5 educational programs telling you your job as the president. We always teach the presidents the rules. Your campus will have one, your IFC will have one, you'll come to them through the fraternity, because we want to make sure the president understands. But you know what? At the end of the day, even the president, who we expose to probably the highest level of education on all functions and operations of the management of risk, can only do 3 things. You got to set expectations. Here's what I expect from you. I expect you not to get drunk. I expect you not to punch holes in the wall in this house. I expect you not to take women, intoxicated women, up to the private parts of the fraternity house. Because, gentlemen, people don't get raped in the middle of the chapter room. I expect you to not do these things. And, you know, here's, in a way to do that, if you don't want to just say, here's what you can't do, is talk about, here's what it looks like to be a Pi Kappa Alpha. Pull that piece of paper out that everybody has to sign and talk about it in the context of what those values and principles look like. How does a man or a woman walk into a space like I have done on countless occasions and know that I am amongst fraternity men? No one's wearing letters, no one's sporting a bow tie, and I know I'm amongst fraternity men. And I know because I see their values in action. You have to set expectations. How are you setting the expectations for your chapter? How are you telling not just the newest members, but the membership what they are expected to do? And then you can intervene. And you can think about early intervention. When are we going to have a problem? That could look like, you know, the guy, your chapter's just come off a hazing investigation. You had a near miss, you had a membership review, but you survived. And that one guy is still in the chapter. And you set your expectation. No more hazing the pledges. We're done. And you got that one guy. Intervention looks like this. Don't give him a little. And tell the new guys, the new members, if you really can't manage men, tell them he's a problem. He calls, he texts, he emails, he says show up, he pulls you to the side, he tries to corral you off at a tailgate, he tries to pull you into a secret part of the house at a party. You say, don't go. This is the guy that you respect, you don't talk trash about, You learn his name, his history, get his signature, but you don't do things. If he tells you to do something, don't go. Because that's what men say to men. Intervention. Don't let him on the bus. Pre-gaming, don't let him on the bus. Too drunk, don't let her in the door. You're afraid that something's going to happen, like she's going to stumble off from your party, and then the university is going to say the last house she was at was the PIKE house, so obviously the Pikes gave her liquor because we never believe them and they have to prove themselves innocent instead of us trying to find them guilty. I've heard all that, right? Then when you ask, you don't send her off on her own. You go find one of those women, and there's a lot of them there, and you say, hey, I need your help. I want to make sure this girl's okay. Can't let her in. Intervention. And when you have to, guys, you hold people accountable. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to have a conversation. One of the hardest things to do in the fraternity is use your own standards board. It is a difficult thing to hold a brother accountable. But you got to do it. This is your capacity with the management of risk. You got to unpack your own problems. You may have a chapter that manages your alcohol events to a T. Most of the men I've worked with as a 16-year chapter advisor told me, I'm never worried about the big events. The big blowout parties, we're good. It's that after the bar closes, people just coming around to party that I'm worried about. That's the problem they have to unpack. Not concerned about the parties that we have at the third-party vendors, not concerned about that. It's those random pickup house parties that bother me. That's the problem you got to unpack. And the questions you got to ask is, why is this a problem? How have we set our expectations? Have we used what's within our capacity to intervene when people aren't meeting them? And even if we do intervene and people are not coming along, how are we holding them accountable? And at what level will we stop accepting the risk? Risk management is one of the purest forms of self-governance that exists in the national fraternity movement. You have been in this conversation longer than any other collective body of college students in this country. We have been talking about hazing and alcohol and risk with you for much longer than we've been talking about it with other students. The management of risk and the conversations about it will not go away. You will talk about the rules and the policies of this fraternity. You will sign a document that you will support them. Insurance providers will send you communication throughout the year. Your advisors will be asked to have conversation. The attorneys who support this fraternity will come into these rooms and make sure you understand your legal obligation. And all of that has to continue. But at the end of the day, gentlemen, this is about the fraternity. And you honoring who you already said you were going to be. I don't know all the language of your fraternity, and I didn't memorize your statement of your commitment to standards. But I think the words dignity, respect, and care were somewhere in that language. And at the end of the day, every decision you make, to comply, to not comply, to communicate, to not communicate, to hold accountable, to not hold accountable, it's about this fraternity. There are men at this meeting who have made the decision, an independent decision. They're probably having a great time right now, out somewhere, maybe sleeping it off, maybe out and about on the streets of Memphis. And they're thinking to themselves, they're not taking roll. We paid to get there. It's none of their business. But you know why it is the business of this fraternity? Because they made a decision as an individual, but they're also supposed to have a commitment to their brothers. Their brothers won't get this information that your brothers will get, whatever you're learning in these rooms. They made a commitment to the fraternity. You're in the room making a commitment to the fraternity. You're following through on it. And somehow we hope that what you come together and learn here will make your community better, because that's another key part of this. And they made one decision as independent men. They're not bad men. They don't need to be punished. They don't need their pins pulled. But I wish that they understood that by not being in these rooms, and for those of you who haven't been in these rooms all day, that is as simple a decision that you could make that's about the fraternity. My struggle is when you can't make the choice to suit up and show up here, do you have the capacity to make the choice back at your chapter about what risk you will and won't accept and think about this fraternity?